The Revolutionary War waged by the American colonies against Great Britain influenced political ideas and revolutions around the globe, as a small fledgling nation won its freedom from the greatest military power of its time. Who were the Sons of Liberty? Most famous for their role in the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty used grassroots activism to push back against British rule. The Sons of Liberty were a grassroots group of instigators and provocateurs in colonial America who used an extreme form of civil disobedience, threats, and in some cases actual violence, to intimidate loyalists and outrage the British government. The goal of the radicals was to push moderate colonial leaders into a confrontation with the British Crown. The Sons marked one of their early victories in December 1765. The Stamp Act, the first tax imposed directly on American colonists by the British government, had only been in effect for a month, when a group of Boston merchants and craftsmen sent a letter to Andrew Oliver, the newly appointed official collector of stamps. The group informed Oliver that he was to show up the next day at noon at the Liberty Tree in the city's south end to publicly resign. "Provided that you comply with the above, you shall be treated with the greatest politeness and humanity," the letter explained. The message left to Oliver's imagination what terrible fate might befall him if he didn't comply. Oliver didn't need much persuading. He appeared as demanded, walking through the streets of Boston in a driving rainstorm, and quit his job, to the cheers of a crowd of 2,000 people. It was an exhibition of the fearsome clout of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons likely formed from a secretive group of 9 Boston-based patriots who called themselves the Loyal Nine. The first Sons chapters sprung up in Boston and New York City, but other cells soon appeared in other colonies as well. The group may have taken its name from a speech given in Parliament by Isaac Barr, an Irish member sympathetic to the colonists, who warned that the British government's behavior has caused the blood of these Sons of Liberty to recoil within them. Their most famous act of disobedience was destroying 92,000 pounds of British tea in Boston Harbor in December 1773. The Boston Tea Party, as the act would become known, was one of the key events that pushed the colonies and the British government toward war. Prominent leaders included Samuel Adams, John Hancock. The Sons' most prominent leader was Samuel Adams, the son of a wealthy brewer who was more interested in radical rabble-rousing than commerce. Adams wrote his master's thesis at Harvard on the lawfulness of resisting British rule. While George Washington eventually led the war effort against the British, the truth is that there might not have been a fight to begin with had it not been for the work of Sam Adams, writes historian Les Standiford. Another key member was John Hancock, who later was immortalized by his flamboyant signature on the Declaration of Independence. James Otis, Paul Revere, Benedict Arnold, and Dr. Benjamin Rush, among others, were also involved in the group. Adams and Hancock in particular were so loathed and feared by the British that when General Thomas Gage offered amnesty to Bostonians who stopped their resistance in 1775, he made a point of excluding the two men, whose offenses are of too flagitious a nature not to be punished severely. It's not hard to understand why Gage took a hard line against them. After forming in the summer of 1765, the Boston Sons chapter marched through the streets and burned stamp officer Oliver's effigy, and then broke into and looted his house. When Massachusetts Lieutenant Government and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson, a loyalist, declined to renounce the Stamp Act, they similarly looted and destroyed his house as well. The Sons didn't stop there. After Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed import duties on goods such as china and glass, Adams organized a boycott to keep British goods out of Massachusetts altogether. According to Adams' biographer Dennis Fraden, the Sons enforced the boycott by sending boys to smash the windows and smear excrement on the walls of local shops that didn't comply. If that didn't work, the proprietor faced the risk of being kidnapped and tarred and feathered, a painful, humiliating torture that could leave lasting scars. Violence was not necessarily accepted as a regular feature of politics, but there was an understanding that it might be part of politics as a last resort, explains Benjamin L. Karp, a historian at Brooklyn College. During this time, the Sons' core views evolved, Karp says. They rejected the British notion that they had fought the French and Indian War on behalf of the colonists, and that as a result, the Americans were obligated to pay for continued upkeep of British soldiers in North America. But beyond that, they also rejected the authority of the British Parliament to make laws for Americans. Most of all, they argued the British government could not compel Americans to pay taxes. Their overarching goals similarly shifted over time. At the outset, most Sons of Liberty only wanted something limited, for Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, Karp explains. But over time, more and more Sons of Liberty became convinced that independence was the answer. The Boston Tea Party. Parliament's passage in December 1773 of the Tea Act, which propped up the financially struggling British East India Company by giving it a virtual monopoly on selling tea to the colonies, pushed the Sons to become even more brazen. The law threatened the livelihood of the American merchants who had been importing tea from Dutch traders. The Sons couldn't let that stand. "I don't think the Bostonians set out to destroy property. I think they felt it was a last resort," Karp says. Their first preference would have been to send the tea back. But when the merchants, consignees, were unwilling, the ship captains were unwilling, it would have ruined them, and the governor was unwilling to bend the rules for them. They felt they had no choice. If they'd allowed the tea to land, they knew that customers wouldn't be able to resist it, so they would have paid the tax on it and let a monopoly company, the East India Company, muscle into the local market, Karp says. The Bostonians also knew that if they let the tea be unloaded, they'd lose standing in the eyes of other Sons of Liberty groups in New York, Philadelphia, and other places, he notes. The Sons' defiance of the British not only helped spur the Revolutionary War, it also fostered an American tradition of grassroots activism that various activist groups have applied over the centuries to push for change. 7 hard-fought battles that helped win the American Revolution. While the British were often better equipped and trained, these events proved critical in ultimately securing Americans' victory in the war. Americans' struggle for independence required 6 years of hard combat, and its outcome was far from clear at the beginning. There were many moments along the way when it appeared that the British, with their well-equipped, well-trained army and navy, had the upper hand against colonial resistance to their rule. But again and again, the Americans managed to rebound from defeats, overcome hardships and win what often were surprising victories. Here are some of the key milestones in the fight that ultimately led to the creation of a new nation. 1. Capture of Fort Ticonderoga, May 10, 1775. Fort Ticonderoga, along Lake Champlain in northeastern New York, was in a strategic position between Canada and the Hudson River Valley. Nevertheless, the British, who may not have taken the rebellious Americans seriously, chose to defend it lightly, with a garrison of only about 50 men. The Green Mountain Boys, a Vermont-based militia, decided to take advantage of the British short-sightedness. At dawn on May 10, a force of less than 100 militiamen, led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, crossed the lake and surprised the still-sleeping British. It was the first real victory of the Revolutionary War, and boosted the colonists' morale. Even more importantly, the Americans were able to seize and repurpose the fort's cannons and transport them to Boston, for use in the siege of British-held Boston. Without that artillery, the early part of the Revolutionary War might have taken a very different course, according to Lycoming College history professor Christopher Pearl. There would most likely have been a much fiercer struggle during the siege of Boston, giving the British Army the ability to successfully advance on American positions, he explains. Instead, with the guns in hand, the rather ragtag American army created a formidable siege that forced the British to evacuate the city. 2. Siege of Boston, April 1775 to March 17, 1776. Though the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, American militiamen inflicted heavy losses. With boosted confidence, the Americans continued their efforts to take the city of Boston from the British. In January 1776, the Americans were able to bring in 50 cannons seized from Fort Ticonderoga and set them up in fortifications around Boston. In early March, they bombarded the city's British defenders for 2 straight days, and General George Washington moved several thousand troops into position at Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city and its harbor. British General William Howe realized that his troops were in an indefensible position and withdrew, ending an 8-year-long occupation of Boston. 3. Battle of Trenton, December 26, 1776. In the winter of late 1776, the Americans were in a tough position. After losses at the battles of White Plains and Forts Washington and Lee, General George Washington's army had to retreat from the pursuing British across New Jersey and take refuge in Pennsylvania. Washington and his troops camped out along the banks on the west side of the Delaware River, where soldiers tried to rekindle their zeal by reading Thomas Paine's pamphlet The American Crisis, which exhorted them not follow the example of the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot who melted away when times got tough. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph, Payne wrote. Washington knew that the American forces needed to make a bold move to reassert themselves. On Christmas Eve 1776, he loaded 2,400 men into boats and crossed the icy Delaware, and then marched 10 miles in the darkness to Trenton, where at dawn, they caught a garrison of 1,500 Hessian troops by surprise. While some of the German soldiers managed to escape, most were captured, and their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was shot and mortally wounded. The remaining Hessians surrendered to Washington, giving the Americans a desperately needed victory. 4. Battle of Saratoga, September 19 to October 7, 1777. At Saratoga, one of the most decisive battles of the Revolution, the Americans defeated British troops advancing southward from Canada, and prevented them from seizing control of New York's Hudson River Valley. As British General John Burgoyne and an army of about 7,500 British soldiers headed south, American General Horatio Gates and thousands of Americans awaited him at Bemis Heights, just south of Saratoga, where they had built fortifications and positioned cannon. The British, who were reinforced by 500 German soldiers, sustained heavy casualties in the initial confrontation on September 19, and found themselves trapped in the wilderness with a dwindling supply of food. Desperate for a way out, Burgoyne mounted a second attack on October 7, but the Americans, whose ranks by then had swelled to 13,000, pushed him back. General Benedict Arnold, who was still on the American side at the time, led a charge that captured a German redoubt, even though Arnold sustained a serious leg wound in the process. After trying unsuccessfully to flee, the British surrendered on October 17. Without a doubt, the Americans could not have won the war without their great victory at Saratoga, explains Willard Stern Randall, a professor emeritus of history at Champlain College and author of numerous books, including the upcoming The Founders' Fortunes, How Money Shaped the Birth of America. It convinced the French that with their aid, the Americans could defeat the British. French cannons at Saratoga proved decisive, Randall notes, just as the French fleet ultimately helped seal the Americans' victory at Yorktown a few years later. 5. Battle of Kings Mountain, October 7, 1780. Kings Mountain is not a well-known battle of the Revolutionary War, but it was critical to stopping the momentum that British General Charles Lord Cornwallis had built by capturing Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780. A few months after that victory, Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson to recruit a loyalist militia to protect Cornwallis' flank as he advanced through the South. But Ferguson ran into a tough, resourceful foe, American militiamen from the South Carolina backcountry and Appalachian Mountains, who were crackshots and skilled in stealthy movement. The two forces, 900 Americans commanded by Colonel Isaac Shelby and others, and 1,105 under Ferguson on the British side, met on a rocky hilltop in western South Carolina. The Americans attacked Ferguson's position from all sides, shooting Ferguson off his horse and killing him, and his force surrendered after suffering heavy casualties. Until Kings Mountain, it looked to everyone like the British were correct to see the South as the Revolution's soft underbelly, explains Woody Holton, a professor of history at the University of South Carolina, and author of Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. In addition to disrupting Cornwallis' plans, the battle also demonstrated that American riflemen could fire, retreat and reload quickly enough to defeat a British bayonet charge, according to Holton. That provided them with a potent new technique. 6. Battle of Cowpens, January 17, 1781. When the British fought on to establish control of the South, American General George Washington sent forces headed by General Nathanael Greene into South Carolina to thwart them, leading to the critical Battle of Cowpens. Greene dispatched a contingent of 1,065 led by Brigadier General Daniel Morgan to south of the Catawba River, on a mission to cut British supply lines. To counter Morgan, British Commander General Cornwallis sent a force of 1,150 men commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, an elite officer with a brutal reputation for allowing his forces to massacre Americans who tried to surrender. Tarleton chased Morgan's forces, but didn't have good intelligence about how many men the Americans had, a disadvantage that proved critical. The two sides confronted one another at Cowpens, a pasture near Thickety Creek. In a crafty move, Morgan organized a line of his men to fire a couple of volleys and then retreat, creating the illusion that the Americans were fleeing in panic. When the Tarleton's forces chased them, they ran into a withering barrage of gunfire from another line of American riflemen that Morgan had hidden, followed by a cavalry attack led by William Washington, a distant cousin of George Washington, that routed the British. The defeat at Cowpens forced Cornwallis to give up his effort to take South Carolina. He pursued Greene's men into North Carolina, where he defeated Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. But Cornwallis' army was so depleted at that point that he had to return to Virginia to rest and re-equip his soldiers. That created an opportunity for General Washington to trap him, and set up the Battle of Yorktown. 7. Battle of Yorktown, September 29 to October 19, 1781. After 6 years of war, the British and the Americans were like a pair of exhausted boxers, struggling to make it through the final round. The British were beset by a lack of public support at home, while the Americans were burdened with war debt, food shortages, and sagging morale. Something had to give. General George Washington decided to go for a knockout. Washington had the option of attacking the British occupiers in New York City, but instead, he and Lieutenant General Comte de Rochambeau, who had thousands of French soldiers under his command, opted to march south to Yorktown, Virginia, where General Cornwallis and his 9,000 troops were resting. As 8,000 American and French soldiers headed to Virginia, the French fleet defeated the British Navy in the Battle of the Capes and seized control of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, preventing British ships from coming to Cornwallis' rescue. By late September, Washington and de Rochambeau had reached Yorktown, where they were joined by another nearly 12,000 militia and American and French soldiers. They dug trenches around the fortifications that Cornwallis had built to protect his army. Then, a few weeks later, the Americans began bombarding the British. On the night of October 14, the Americans and French attacked the British redoubts, capturing some of the fortifications. On October 17, the British sent an officer with a white handkerchief to discuss surrender terms, and 2 days later, the last major battle of the Revolution was over. Yorktown sapped Britain's will to fight a long war, notes Carol Van West, a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. The following March, the British Parliament passed legislation authorizing peace negotiations. Americans had won the war. 7 Black heroes of the American Revolution. They include a spy, a poet, a guerrilla fighter, and foot soldiers who fought on both sides of the war. During the American Revolution, thousands of Black Americans jumped into the war, on both sides of the conflict. But unlike their white counterparts, they weren't just fighting for independence or to maintain British control. In a time when the vast majority of African Americans lived in bondage, their forced labor fueling the economy of the fledgling nation, most took up arms hoping to be freed from the literal shackles of chattel slavery. In fact, when enslaved people had choice in the matter, according to historian Edward Ayers of the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, Virginia, they signed on with whichever side seemed most likely to grant them personal freedom. For some slaves turned soldiers, the Revolution's promise of liberty became a reality. But despite the Patriots' lofty rhetoric about liberty and justice for all, America's war for independence didn't herald widespread emancipation for enslaved people of color. America's northern states didn't pass laws to abolish slavery until 1804, and even then, some areas phased it out slowly. Southern states would cling to the brutal practice for more than a half-century longer. Historians estimate that between 5,000 and 8,000 African-descended people participated in the Revolution on the Patriot side, and that upward of 20,000 served the crown. Many fought with extraordinary bravery and skill, their exploits lost to our collective memory. Below are the stories of several exceptional African American figures, a martyr, a poet, and a double agent among them, whose crucial contributions to the conflict have been remembered to history. 1. Crispus Attucks, martyr. Crispus Attucks, whom many historians credit as the first man to die for the rebellion, became a symbol of Black American patriotism and sacrifice. In 1770, as tension mounted between British and colonial sailors in Massachusetts ports, distrust and competition among them grew. These pressures came to a head on March 5, when an angry confrontation turned into a slaughter known as the Boston Massacre. Witnesses say that Attucks, a middle-aged runaway enslaved man of African and Native American descent, who worked as a sailor and a rope-maker, played an active role in the initial scuffle. Of the 5 colonists killed, he was said to be the first to fall, making him the first martyr to the American cause. He was taken down by 2 musket balls to the chest. 2. Salem Poor, patriot soldier. Salem Poor began life as a Massachusetts slave and ended it as an American hero. Born into bondage in the late 1740s, he purchased his own freedom 2 decades later for £27, the equivalent of a few $1,000s today. Soon after, Poor joined the fight for independence. Enlisting multiple times, he is believed to have fought in the battles of Saratoga and Monmouth. He's most famous, however, for his heroism at the Battle of Bunker Hill, where his contributions so impressed fellow soldiers that after the war ended, 14 of them formally recognized his excellent battle skills with a petition to the General Court of Massachusetts. In it, they called him out as a brave and gallant soldier, saying he behaved like an experienced officer. Poor is credited in that battle with killing British Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie, along with several other enemy soldiers. 3. Colonel Tighe, Loyalist guerrilla. Colonel Tighe earned a reputation as the most formidable guerrilla leader in the Revolutionary War. During his years fighting for the British, patriots feared his raids, while their slaves welcomed his help in their liberation. Tighe, originally known as Titus during his early years in slavery in New Jersey, escaped a particularly brutal master in 1775 and joined the British Army after the Crown offered freedom to any enslaved person who enlisted. While Tighe stood out as a soldier from the start, the British didn't station him at pitched battles. They saw more value in using his knowledge of the coveted New Jersey territory, which sat between British-occupied New York and the Patriots' center of government in Philadelphia. The Redcoats needed to take this middle land and believed Tighe could help. The British were right. Tighe excelled at raid warfare there. His familiarity with the area gave him an advantage in attacks on Patriots' lands. And his daring, skillful execution kept his Black Brigade soldiers largely unscathed as they plundered homes, took supplies, freed slaves, and sometimes even assassinated Patriot slaveholders renowned for their cruelty. The British recognized Tighe's impact on their success and, out of respect for all his contributions, bestowed on him the honorific title of colonel. He remains an important symbol of fearless resistance. 4. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, Integrated Revolutionary Force. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the 1st Continental Army unit largely comprised of Black New Englanders, showcased African Americans' skill as soldiers and commitment to their brethren on the battlefield. In the late 1770s, dwindling manpower forced George Washington to reconsider his original decision to ban black people from the Continental Army. So in 1778, a Rhode Island legislature declared that both free and enslaved black people could serve. To attract the latter, the Patriots promised freedom at the end of service. Though relatively small, only about 130 men, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment had an outsized impact. Commanding General John Sullivan praised its soldiers for their success against attacks in the Battle of Newport, saying they displayed desperate valor in repelling 3 furious Hessian, German, infantry assaults. When the Rhode Islanders journeyed to Virginia, where several thousand other soldiers were assembling, they stood out, according to a French military officer there, as most neatly dressed, the best under arms and the most precise in all their maneuvers. And one early historian, William Cooper, lauded their fierce loyalty. When their commander Colonel Christopher Greene was cut down during a surprise early morning attack in May 1781, he wrote, "The sabers of the enemy only reached him through the bodies of his faithful guard of blacks, who hovered over him to protect him, and every one of whom was killed." 5. Phyllis Wheatley, patriot poet. Phyllis Wheatley was a revolutionary intellectual who waged a war for freedom with her words. Captured as a child in West Africa, then taken to North America and enslaved, Wheatley had an unusual experience in bondage. Her owners educated her and supported her literary pursuits. In 1773, at around age 20, Wheatley became the first African American and third woman to publish a book of poetry in the young nation. Shortly after, her owners freed her. Influential colonists read Wheatley's poems and lauded her talent. Her work, which reflected her close knowledge of the ancient classics as well as biblical theology, carried strong messages against slavery and became a rallying cry for abolitionists. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, maybe refined and join th angelic train. She also advocated for independence, artfully expressing support for George Washington's Revolutionary War in her poem, To His Excellency, General Washington. Washington, who himself had been forced to end his formal education at age 11, appreciated Wheatley's support and extolled her talent. The commander even invited her to meet, explaining he would be happy to see a person so favored by the muses. 6. Peter Salem, colonial hero. Peter Salem is best known for his crucial contributions at the outset of the Revolution. Born into slavery in Massachusetts in the mid-18th century, Salem joined the Patriots in the earliest battles of the war, participating as a Minuteman at Lexington and Concord. His owners supported this decision and freed him so that he could remain enlisted. Salem earned his place in history for his role in one of the most important Revolutionary War fights, the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. Although the British defeated the Continental Army in this encounter, it wasn't a total loss for the Patriots. Their killing of many redcoats encouraged them to keep up the fight. Many historians credit Salem with killing a key officer of the Crown, Major John Pitcairn, just as he was scaling the top of the American redoubt and demanding that the Patriots surrender. Salem's role is believed to have been memorialized in John Trumbull's painting The Battle of Bunker's Hill. 7. James Armistead Lafayette, the double agent. During the Revolution, James Armistead's life changed drastically from an enslaved person in Virginia to a double agent passing intel and misinformation between the two warring sides. When Armistead joined the Patriots' efforts, they assigned him to infiltrate the enemy. So he pretended to be a runaway slave wanting to serve the Crown, and was welcomed by the British with open arms. At first they assigned him menial support tasks, but he soon became a more strategic resource due to his vast knowledge of the local terrain. Armistead's role got more interesting when the British directed him to spy on the Patriots. Since his loyalty remained with the colonists, he claimed to be bringing the British intel about the Continental Army, but he was actually pushing incorrect information to foil their plans. In the meantime, he was learning details of the British battle plans, which he brought back to his commander, General Marquis de Lafayette. This served the Americans well. Because of Armistead's efforts, they got the insight they needed to successfully execute the decisive siege of Yorktown, which effectively ended the war. Years later, after a testimonial from the French general helped secure Armistead's freedom, the former slave changed his surname to Lafayette. Why was the Declaration of Independence written? The Declaration of Independence played a critical role in unifying the colonies for the bloody struggle they faced. When the first skirmishes of the Revolutionary War broke out in Massachusetts in April 1775, few people in the American colonies wanted to separate from Great Britain entirely. But as the war continued, and Britain called out massive armed forces to enforce its will, more and more colonists came to accept that asserting independence was the only way forward. And the Declaration of Independence would play a critical role in unifying the colonies from the bloody struggle they now faced. The road to revolution was paved with taxes. Over the decade following the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, a series of unpopular British laws met with stiff opposition in the colonies, fueling a bitter struggle over whether Parliament had the right to tax the colonists without the consent of the representative colonial governments. This struggle erupted into violence in 1770 when British troops killed 5 colonists in the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, outrage over the Tea Act of 1773 prompted colonists to board an East India Company ship in Boston Harbor and dump its cargo into the sea in the now infamous Boston Tea Party. In response, Britain cracked down further with the coercive acts, going so far as to revoke the colonial charter of Massachusetts and close the port of Boston. Resistance to the intolerable acts, as they became known, led to the formation of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, which denounced taxation without representation but stopped short of demanding independence from Britain. Would colonists reconcile or separate? Then the first shots rang out between colonial and British forces at Lexington and Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill cost hundreds of American lives, along with 1,000 killed on the British side. Some 20,000 troops under General George Washington faced off against a British garrison in the Boston Siege, which ended when the British evacuated in March 1776. Washington then moved his Continental Army to New York, where he assumed, correctly, that a major British invasion would soon take place. Meanwhile, many in the Continental Congress still clung to the assumption that reconciliation with Britain was the ultimate goal. This would soon change, thanks in part to the actions of King George III, who in October 1775 denounced the colonies in front of Parliament and began building up his army and navy to crush their rebellion. In order to have any hope of defeating Britain, the colonists would need support from foreign powers, especially France, which Congress knew they could only get by declaring themselves a separate nation. Thomas Paine disavowed the monarchy. In his best-selling pamphlet, Common Sense, a recent English immigrant named Thomas Paine also helped push the colonists along on their path toward independence. His argument was that we had to break from Britain because the system of the British Constitution was hopelessly flawed. The late Pauline Maier, professor of history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, said in a 2013 lecture on The Making of the Declaration of Independence. Britain had hereditary rule, it had kings, you could never have freedom so long as you had hereditary rule. After Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion to declare independence on June 7, 1776, Congress formed a committee to draft a statement justifying the break with Great Britain. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Jefferson writes. The initial draft of the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson and was presented to the entire Congress on June 28 for debate and revision. In addition to Jefferson's eloquent preamble, the document included a long list of grievances against King George III, who was accused of committing many injuries and usurpations in his quest to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. After 2 days of editing and debate, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, even as a large British fleet and more than 34,000 troops prepared to invade New York. By the time it was formally signed on August 2, printed copies of the document were spreading around the country, being reprinted in newspapers and publicly read aloud. While the road to independence had been long and twisted, the effect of its declaration made an impact right away. It changed the whole character of the war, Maier said. These were people who for a year had been making war against a king with whom they were trying to effect a reconciliation, to whom they were publicly professing loyalty. Now heart in hand, as one person said, could move together. They had a cause to fight for. 9 things you may not know about the Declaration of Independence. 9 surprising facts about the iconic founding document adopted on July 4, 1776. 1. The Declaration of Independence wasn't signed on July 4, 1776. On July 1, 1776, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, and on the following day, 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of Richard Henry Lee's motion for independence. The delegates then spent the next 2 days debating and revising the language of a statement drafted by Thomas Jefferson. On July 4, Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, and as a result, the date is celebrated as Independence Day. Nearly a month would go by, however, before the actual signing of the document took place. First, New York's delegates didn't officially give their support until July 9 because their home assembly hadn't yet authorized them to vote in favor of independence. Next, it took 2 weeks for the declaration to be engrossed, written on parchment in a clear hand. Most of the delegates signed on August 2, but several Elbridge Gerry, Oliver Wolcott, Lewis Morris, Thomas McKean and Matthew Thornton, signed on a later date. 2 others, John Dickinson and Robert R. Livingston, never signed at all. The signed parchment copy now resides at the National Archives in the Rotunda for the Charters of Freedom, alongside the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. 2. More than one copy of the Declaration of Independence exists. After the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, the Committee of 5, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman and Robert R. Livingston, was charged with overseeing the reproduction of the approved text. This was completed at the shop of Philadelphia printer John Dunlap. On July 5, Dunlap's copies were dispatched across the 13 colonies to newspapers, local officials and the commanders of the Continental troops. These rare documents, known as Dunlap broadsides, predate the engrossed version signed by the delegates. Of the hundreds thought to have been printed on the night of July 4, only 26 copies survive. Most are held in museum and library collections, but 3 are privately owned. 3. When news of the Declaration of Independence reached New York City, it started a riot. By July 9, 1776, a copy of the Declaration of Independence had reached New York City. With hundreds of British naval ships occupying New York Harbor, revolutionary spirit and military tensions were running high. George Washington, commander of the Continental Forces in New York, read the document aloud in front of City Hall. A raucous crowd cheered the inspiring words, and later that day tore down a nearby statue of George III. The statue was subsequently melted down and shaped into more than 42,000 musket balls for the fledgling American Army. 4. 8 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were born in the UK. While the majority of the members of the Second Continental Congress were native-born Americans, 8 of the men voting for independence from Britain were born in the United Kingdom. Button Gwinnett and Robert Morris were born in England, Francis Lewis was born in Wales, James Wilson and John Witherspoon were born in Scotland, George Taylor and Matthew Thornton were born in Ireland, and James Smith hailed from Northern Ireland. 5. One signer of the Declaration of Independence later recanted. Richard Stockton, a lawyer from Princeton, New Jersey, became the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to recant his support of the Revolution. On November 30, 1776, the hapless delegate was captured by the British and thrown in jail. After months of harsh treatment and meager rations, Stockton repudiated his signature on the Declaration of Independence and swore his allegiance to King George III. A broken man when he regained his freedom, he took a new oath of loyalty to the state of New Jersey in December 1777. 6. There was a 44-year age difference between the youngest and oldest signers. The oldest signer was Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old when he scrawled his name on the parchment. The youngest was Edward Rutledge, a lawyer from South Carolina who was only 26 at the time. Rutledge narrowly beat out fellow South Carolinian Thomas Lynch Jr., just 4 months his senior, for the title. 7. 2 additional copies of the Declaration of Independence have been found in the last 25 years. In 1989, a Philadelphia man found an original Dunlap broadside hidden in the back of a picture frame he bought at a flea market for $4. One of the few surviving copies from the official first printing of the Declaration, it was in excellent condition and sold for $8.1 million in 2000. A 26th known Dunlap broadside emerged at the British National Archives in 2008 in a box of papers sent to the Crown centuries ago by a British official in colonial America. 8. The Declaration of Independence spent World War II in Fort Knox. On December 23, 1941, just over 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the signed declaration, together with the Constitution, was removed from public display and prepared for evacuation out of Washington, D.C. Under the supervision of armed guards, the founding document was packed in a specially designed container, latched with padlocks, sealed with lead and placed in a larger box. All told, 150 pounds of protective gear surrounded the parchment. On December 26 and 27, accompanied by Secret Service agents, it traveled by train to Louisville, Kentucky, where a cavalry troop of the 13th Armored Division escorted it to Fort Knox. The Declaration was returned to Washington, D.C., in 1944. 9. There is something written on the back of the Declaration of Independence. In the movie National Treasure, Nicolas Cage's character claims that the back of the Declaration contains a treasure map with encrypted instructions from the Founding Fathers, written in invisible ink. Unfortunately, this is not the case. There is, however, a simpler message, written upside down across the bottom of the signed document, Original Declaration of Independence dated July 4, 1776. No one knows who exactly wrote this or when, but during the Revolutionary War years the parchment was frequently rolled up for transport. It's thought that the text was added as a label. Why do we celebrate July 4th with fireworks? The Independence Day tradition dates nearly as far back as the country's beginning and was proposed by one of the Founding Fathers. It's hard to imagine Independence Day without fireworks. But how did this tradition get started? As it turns out, setting off mini explosions of all shapes and colors, but particularly red, white and blue, on July 4th goes back almost as far as American independence itself. John Adams predicts celebrations. Fireworks have a long and colorful history, but the story of how they became ubiquitous on July 4th dates to the summer of 1776, during the first months of the Revolutionary War. On July 1st, delegates of the Continental Congress were in Philadelphia, debating over whether the 13 original colonies should declare their independence from Britain's Parliament as well as King George III himself. That night, news arrived that British ships had sailed into New York Harbor, posing an immediate threat to the Continental troops commanded by George Washington. On July 2, delegates from 12 colonies voted in favor of independence. New York would follow suit on July 9, and the motion carried. On July 3, even as Congress revised a draft of the Declaration composed by Thomas Jefferson, an excited John Adams took up his pen to write to his wife, Abigail. "The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America," Adams wrote. "I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated, by succeeding generations, as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." Adams was off by a couple of days. First organized celebration held on July 4, 1777. On July 4, after making a total of 86, mostly small, changes to Jefferson's draft, Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, though most of the delegates didn't even sign the document until August 2. Some impromptu celebrations greeted the Declaration's first public readings on July 8, in front of local militia troops in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but the first organized celebration of Independence Day would take place in Philadelphia on July 4, 1777. Yesterday, the 4th of July, being the anniversary of the independence of the United States of America, was celebrated in this city with demonstrations of joy and festivity, reported the Pennsylvania Evening Post on July 5, 1777. About noon, all the armed ships and galleys in the river were drawn up before the city, dressed in the gayest manner, with the colors of the United States and streamers displayed. After each ship's cannon fired a 13-gun salute, in honor of the 13 colonies, the festivities continued, including an elegant dinner, a military demonstration and a performance by a Hessian band. The evening was closed with the ringing of bells, the Evening Post reported, and at night there was a grand exhibition of fireworks, which began and concluded with 13 rockets, on the Commons, and the city was beautifully illuminated. Did you know? Adams lived to see exactly 50 years of American independence. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of Congress's adoption of the Declaration of Independence, he died at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, just 5 hours after Jefferson's death in Virginia. Adams's hometown of Boston saw its own fireworks display that July 4, as Colonel Thomas Crafts of the Sons of Liberty took the opportunity to set off fireworks and shells over Boston Common. In the years to come, various cities continued the tradition of celebrating independence, holding picnics, parades, speeches and fireworks displays for the occasion, though Boston was the first to designate July 4 an official holiday, in 1783. War of 1812 inspires broader celebrations with fireworks. By the time Independence Day celebrations really took off after the War of 1812, another conflict pitting the United States against Britain, fireworks were even more widely available. They would become an increasingly important part of the festivities in the years to come, as public safety concerns caused cannon and gunfire to be gradually phased out of celebrations. In 1870, Congress established Independence Day as an official holiday. By 1898, a reporter would note that the American 4th of July is the greatest event the maker of firecrackers knows, historian James Heinz recorded in the 4th of July Encyclopedia. As every July 4th brings numerous fireworks-related accidents, some causing injuries and even deaths, many cities and states would pass bans on different types of pyrotechnics. Adams's native Massachusetts, for example, now bans all consumer fireworks. Despite these safety concerns, Americans spend somewhere around $1 billion on fireworks each July 4th, allowing for a nationwide celebration of independence John Adams would surely have appreciated.